All right. Well, welcome everyone. I'm looking forward to presenting to you on how to facilitate for virtual audiences. So this is going to include some introduction to just facilitation in general, as well as some tips and tricks that are really specific to facilitating a virtual setting. So I have a presentation I'm going to walk through for the first half, but then I'm going to switch to, doing some demo in Zoom and helping you kind of walk through and introduce you to some of the features available. All right, so I'm going to go ahead. Oh, looks like you've got screen sharing disabled, Elizabeth.
Sorry.
All right, we good?
Should be okay now.
Okay. All right, can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So the art of facilitation. What is facilitation? So it is to make easier. That's the act of facilitation. And it has its roots in the word facile. So if you speak French, that is the French word for easy, obviously probably going back to Latin as well. And I would really describe facilitation as a performance skill. This is kind of a mix of, preparation, organization in advance, but also like in the act of it, there is kind of an art to it in terms of like performing, keeping an audience's attention, and encouraging them to engage. And, like with any performance-based skill, it's something that's going to get easier the more that you do it. So it's something you can definitely practice at and improve on. And I think the other thing really important to highlight when it comes to facilitation, like with any performance, sometimes things go wrong. And I think it's really important to remember that you need to learn from those and not beat yourself up too much, because, this is all cumulative as you build up your skills when it comes to facilitation. So how do you prepare when it comes to facilitating? Sometimes, you've got those MCs that can really do stuff off the cuff, really good at just sort of reading the room and an audience. But what we're going to do is really encourage you to plan. So to make sure that your facilitation is successful, you really want to take your time and spend the bulk of your time in this sort of planning area here. And I've got specific steps within sort of this planning process that we're going to go through. And then I'll have some tips and tricks when it comes to the actual execution of your event, as well as some things to think about after the events happened. All right, so first step when you're planning, this is the ask. So you want to gather your requirements. I'm assuming most of us on the call here today are anthropologists, so we know how to ask questions. So some of the questions you want to make sure to ask, what's the purpose and goal of this meeting? Why are we doing this? Should this even be happening? And sometimes in the case of meetings, maybe it should be an email. Maybe it should be, just a short phone call. It's important to really understand what the goal and purpose of, especially if you're going to be asking for people's time. Next, what is the date and time? You want to make sure, especially in a virtual setting, you know what the time zone is. That's kind of one of the first points of failure you can run into when it comes to a virtual event. You want to try and get an understanding what the group size is. Sometimes you might not have like an exact number, but if you can get a rough idea of how many people are going to be attending, that can really help when you're trying to think through what types of exercises or activities you're going to have built into the actual meeting or event. You want to have an understanding of who the audience is. Is this going to be students? Is it primarily other faculty members? Is it possibly, funders or other members of your community? What is the event format? So is this going to be virtual? Is it in person, or is it hybrid? I feel like, hybrid events have kind of dwindled a little, but I still think they're really valuable, especially if you're thinking about accessibility, making sure that everybody can attend a particular event, such as like a community meeting. What tools will you be using? So, when it comes to a virtual meeting, is it Zoom like we're on today? Could it be Teams, or is there another sort of format or specific resource that organization needs you to use? And then what are the real expected outcomes for this event? So you want to say, want to understand what is essential, like what really, really needs to happen, be done or achieved within this time period that you're working with. And then I think it's also important to understand like what's the desired. So what would be the kind of ideal state? What would they really like to have happen in relation to like what is essential and needs to get done? And I think that'll help in terms of like determining what the scope is of the meeting and what are your like must-haves versus your nice-to-haves. And then last, is there anything else you should be aware of in terms of context? Is it a holiday? Is there maybe a big event going on in the community? Just important things to be aware of as you go into the actual event. All right, so next step, you want to take all that information that you've gathered and then brainstorm. This is your sort of imagining moment. And you want to tap into your creativity. This can be a fun sort of process as you think through, what really could this event be like? And I'll be introducing some resources for you as you sort of develop the agenda and plan for the meeting. But first, what's the ideal versus, what feels realistic? And there's sometimes like what you want to do, and then there's what you can't do. So recognizing where those restrictions are, and really think through what you need to do to start getting prepared. When going back to the resources that the requirements that you gathered, next you want to reflect on, who your audience is. So if you can tune into them in advance, that's ideal. Sometimes you don't always have that information going in, and you might want to just try and think of a more general audience. So if you do have the opportunity, I would advise you to meet with the key stakeholders in advance of the meeting. So for example, I helped facilitate the Anthropology Career Readiness, our second year anniversary meeting, and Elizabeth and I took time to sit down and talk through, what we wanted to have happen in that meeting, and also understanding who's there and who we're trying to target. You want to build in accessibility. I know, Elizabeth, you probably have some resources around how to build accessible presentations that we could probably share afterwards, but really think through the different ways that accessibility impacts people. One could be making sure that you have captions turned on, which unfortunately we don't have right now, but you can have captioning services. It may be in an in-person event, making sure that you have someone that can do sign. Also thinking about the colors of the text that you're using in your presentations, and also just describing things for those that might be more visually impaired, especially in those sort of virtual settings. I also added in here, plan for personality. So when it comes to your audience, sometimes that one guy is going to be asking you the hard questions, and it could derail the room. So, you want to plan in advance. Maybe you find his best friend to sit next to him and like prep him to like, tell him to hold it to the end. There's different ways that you can kind of plan ahead and be ready for all the different types of people that would be attending your meeting. And, sometimes this is difficult when it comes to visualizing yourself in the audience place. I think it's a good place to start, but also recognize like you may not always have an understanding of where your audience is coming from. So I think doing that empathy exercise and being like, okay, if I were in this 2-hour workshop, would I really want to have all of this happen to me? Is a really good place to start, but also recognize that you may not have all of the information in terms of, what's going on with your audience. So just be ready to be surprised and pivot as you need to. All right, so here's some of my favorite activities that you can build into like a workshop or a meeting that you're doing. And I've also got a link at the bottom there for a really great website called Liberating Structures that has a lot of facilitation techniques that you can build into different activities. I'd say this is really helpful for instructors as well if you're working on designing classroom exercises. So these are a few that I've pulled out and highlighted just because I think they have a lot of benefits for different types of audience members. So the stinky fish exercise. So the stinky fish is this idea of like this, fish that's getting carried around and it's getting stinkier and stinkier, but no one really wants to talk about it. So it's those things that are, the elephants in the room that no one really wants to acknowledge. But this is an exercise that you can do at the start of a meeting as an icebreaker to like maybe get things onto the table. that would maybe potentially come up as issues later on, such as like, hey, it's the day before, the holiday, and none of us are really going to be able to pay attention very well. Or maybe the stinky fish is, hey, we're all really stressed out because we know that there's big change coming, really highlighting, what might be a potential concern. And once you get it out there too, other people might realize that others share similar concerns to them. And it's kind of a great point to start that trust building for the people in that room. The next one, I think you'll probably recognize this one, Elizabeth. It's what, so what, now what? And this is a process for discussion where you want to have, the members of your meeting discuss the question at hand in relation to each of these. So there might be a specific topic you're trying to go through, such as like, we have a problem with not reaching Gen Z. So that's the problem. So what's the impact of not reaching that particular audience? And then, now what, how are you going to go ahead in terms of trying to reach them? So it's a really great sort of framework for working through an issue and encouraging people to engage. Next up is pair share. There's a lot of different ways people can say this, but it's really the exercise of just having somebody turn to the person next to them or discussing a point or a question that's brought up in the meeting. And I think this is a really great one for large settings where, not everybody's going to have the chance to speak, and also, really let those introverts in the room have a chance to talk, but, not feel like they have to share out in front of the entire crowd. And last, chalk talk. So this is one that takes a little preparation in advance. You can do it virtually or in person. So in person, you probably want to set up some easels or have some whiteboards around the room with maybe the question or whatever you're trying to have people react to set up. But you can also set up a virtual whiteboard, which I'm going to be introducing to today, where you want to provide people Post-its and maybe even little sticky dots that they can walk around the room and react, put their comments up. And it's a silent exercise, so this way it gives everybody a chance to contribute without maybe the pressure of feeling like they have to raise their hand and speak in front of everybody. And it's really a great way to capture feedback, especially if you're brainstorming, a big thing. And the little sticky dots, those are fun, for like, the little +1. I agree with this. I like this. I've also done like a heat mapping exercise before too, using sticky dots. Like, where do you click? So those are a few of the activities. There's a lot more out there if you're working on developing a meeting. They're really great ways to gather engagement and also try and make it a little more fun rather than people just sitting and absorbing information and relying on people raising their hands. All right, so your agenda. I would say this is probably one of the most important pieces of planning when it comes to an event. So you want to prepare your agenda and share in advance. So first, you're going to really want to outline that sort of timeline for the event. Note the expected start and end times for each step, recognizing that sometimes this doesn't happen. But you want to try and, meet the goals that you set for yourself. You want to include the purpose, goals, time, location, and anything else an attendee would need to know in advance. So sometimes in my workplace, I'll have what we call like pre-work something that we want people to read in advance. And I usually try to ensure that I get that to people at minimum 48 hours in advance so that they have time to build that reflection into their day before the meeting. I would also say plan your pivot. So you want to add some cushion time. If nobody's actually going to show up till 10:15, you can have the meeting start at 10, but maybe have an icebreaker or something a little more informal built in at the start to kind of ease people into the room. And also, as you think about those pivots, remember what is essential versus desired. So you may have sort of your optimal state of how the meeting's going to go, but you have certain things that you've already noted in your mind that if we don't have enough time for this, I'm going to cut it. And then be sure to share that agenda in advance. If you're working with other people, you may need to end up revising it depending on the feedback that they have. All right, next is tools. So setup and testing. So tools can be a really broad when you're thinking about events. When it comes to in-person, your tools can be just making sure you have enough pens and post-it notes for everybody. If you're working virtually, the tools would be like Zoom or other types of collaboration software out there. They're not necessarily tools, but I would say people can also be a really important resource to support you in planning your meetings. So recruit backup if you can. Test out your setup with someone, especially if you're going to be doing a sort of a large formal event. You want to have that sound check, see if everything's working right. And also, one of the things that I like to do when I'm working virtually is to have sort of a helper to back me up, especially when it comes to watching the chat. Because when you're running the meeting and you're in it, sometimes it's really easy to miss any questions that are coming in via the chat. So having sort of a buddy that's watching that for you and can raise your hands. They also, could be a timekeeper, whatever you need in terms of support for the event. You want to make sure that those helpers understand what their role is and what's expected of them before you go into the actual event. And lastly, and just practice. So familiarize yourself with any software you plan on using. There might be some tools too, like physical ones you want to make sure you know how to use. But I think it's just really making sure you feel as prepared as possible. All right, so event time, show time, it's happening. So the first thing I would want to make sure you do is orient the attendees as they arrive. So if it's in a virtual setting, this might be, reminding everybody to turn their microphones off and mute themselves. And really, sometimes it might require you to guide them in terms of where to find the mute button. And then also orient them to like what the plan is for the day or the event. So review your agenda so that everyone has an understanding of where you're going. They may have not read their email in advance, so can't count on that. My next sort of tip is remember the show must go on unless it doesn't need to. So sometimes you go into a meeting that you think you're going to get all this stuff done, but there may have been a crisis. There may have been, that stinky fish is really, really stinky and you need to spend some more time talking about it. So I think it's important to really have an understanding of the context of what you're doing. So if you're planning a conference, obviously you're not going to stop people from presenting their papers to talk about somebody's feelings. But if you're in a meeting sort of setting in a work context, it might make sense to be like, okay, we're going to table this because we need to address what's going on right now. So I think it's really important to sort of read the room and understand the context that you're in. If you've got something that comes up that's a question, a concern that's recurring, or it could just be somebody raises their hand and brings something up that they want to discuss that's just completely from the left field, out of scope of what you're trying to do, we recommend sending it to the parking lot. So the parking lot, I've done it actually in meetings where I'll have like an easel where I write parking lot on it and we'll take a Post-it note and stick it on there. Or it can just be you take a note down that you're going to include in your follow-up afterwards. And it's a way of recognizing that, like, hey, we understand this is something that you want to contribute, but unfortunately we don't have like the time right now and it's out of scope. And I think it's important also to remember to take the time to actually follow up on the parking lot items, because sometimes people can feel like you're just getting dismissed and never going to ever get talked about again. Next is be assertive and remember your role. I think one of the challenges is, especially if you're a participant as well, if it's like, say, like a work exercise that you're doing, is remembering to direct people back to the agenda and stay on track, and focus on getting others to participate. Because I struggle with those too, as somebody who likes to participate. Sometimes you can get caught up in sort of engaging and participating yourself, but you want to make sure you keep your facilitator hat on. So sometimes that means telling yourself to be quiet and making sure that there's space for others to contribute. And, as we talked about before with those different personalities, you may have some wild cards that are going to pop up and try and derail the conversation. And I think it's really just important to think how about you can handle those different situations with a combination of tact, patience, and sometimes humor in terms of getting things back on track. And make sure to use your backup. Sometimes it's easy to get caught up in the moment. but delegate tasks so you can keep your focus. So a couple other things I would delegate would be such as note taking. So it's really difficult when you're trying to facilitate a meeting and also capture notes. All right, so the event has happened and it's time to reflect. And I would say first, celebrate the completion of the event, however it went. You did it. It might have been a hot mess, but it is done and you did it. It might have also been perfectly wonderful and everything went perfectly. And a couple questions to think about as you do that reflection is, what went well? And make sure to think of like the positives first, because I think sometimes it's easy to go to the negatives. And acknowledge, maybe you did a really good job planning and everything was in order, and, your backup help really helped you, and everyone left feeling like things got done. What could have gone better? Maybe you didn't have a tool ready, maybe there was a glitch, maybe there was an update that you didn't have. Just think about, what you'd want to tweak for next time, especially as you go on to how would you do things differently? All right. And the last step, I think this is a really important one that sometimes gets missed, is to follow up. So send some types of communication out to the people that attended the event. This could be action items and next steps if you're having like a meeting. It could be a summary, notes, or a recording, or any additional resources you want to share with them. Or in some cases, it could be like, hey, this is when the next meeting is. And then second, I would say, if you have the time and if it's something that they're open to, connect with those key stakeholders for a retrospective and share those reflections that you made as appropriate. All right, so here I've got some specific to hosting a virtual event, because I know our goal today was really understanding how to prepare if you're doing, say, an interview or a Q&A session with a guest. So the first thing I would want to suggest is to make sure that your guest is prepared and they have everything they need to be successful. So going back to that gathering requirements, what can you offer your guests from that list to make sure that they're ready and know when they're supposed to be there and what they're going to be facing. Provide them an agenda in a timely manner. And if you are going to have a Q&A, it may be worth taking some time to solicit those questions in advance, and share any sort of planned questions that you have that you're going to be doing for the interview in advance, so they can help prepare some of their thoughts. When it comes for the call for questions, when you get to that sort of Q&A part, you may have some you've collected in advance, say via email or some virtual survey. But there's other mechanisms you can use for collecting questions. And think about like how the audience may feel in terms of asking questions. If you've got like a really engaged group, hand raising may be the best sort of place to start. But if you've got maybe some people a little more nervous or it's a sensitive topic, there's some more indirect ways you could do it, such as having a jar where people just write down their questions and drop it in and you pull them out. It's a little more fair in terms of random when you're pulling out whose question you're getting. Or another one that I think is probably the easiest to do in a virtual setting is to direct people to put their questions in the chat. And that's where it's really important to have your buddy watching the questions to help navigate that. And I would say it's kind of a delicate art in terms of balancing, the time versus the interest in terms of the questions that are popping up. So if you have a lot of people with a lot of questions, it may be worth your time to be like, okay, we're going to only do 5 in the context of this meeting, but our guest has agreed to read through your questions and follow up in writing afterwards. Just acknowledge what is going to be possible in that setting. Or it may be that, we're going to stop here, but they have time to pull back for 30 minutes after this and chat with you if you'd like to come up and say hi. And again, just read the room and pivot if you have to. Sometimes things, come up or you get that awkward question where it's just crickets. And you as a facilitator, it's your job to really help create that sense of ease. So maybe somebody asks your guest a really uncomfortable question and, it's clear that it's not going to be a productive answer for everybody in the room. So you can maybe pause and be like, hey, I really appreciate you bringing that up. I think we're going to move on to the next one, but I'll check in with you afterwards. So it's really, how can you as a facilitator, create a sense of ease for everybody that's in the room. All right, so here's a few other resources that you can look at. I've got the book you recommended, Elizabeth, on here. I hope it's good. That's Mastering Facilitation, a Guide for Assisting Teams and Achieving Great Outcomes. Of course, we've got the Anthropology for Readiness Network on here as a great source for resources. Next, again, is that Liberating Structure site that I mentioned. And the next two are a couple of books that I've enjoyed. The new How by Nilofer Merchant. That one's really more around developing strategy, but she's got a lot of really great exercises in there also, in terms of like, how do you sort of bring a group to a conclusion. And she actually recommended the next book there, Power Tools, which is kind of more targeted at managers, but I think there are some exercises and activities that would be useful in a facilitation context. And I do want to shout out a couple of my teachers when it comes to facilitation. So Valerie Bacchestedt of Everyday Solutions and Kevin Sansbury of Kivra are two of the people that I've been really lucky to attend workshops and trainings on when it comes to facilitation. All right, next, here's some of the tools available. This is obviously not exhaustive, but we're going to talk about Zoom today. And I'll also introduce you to a couple other tools, Jamboard, Mural, and Mentimeter. I will say that Jamboard is free. It's a part of the Google Suite tools that are available. So that's the one I'll probably demo today because it's a little more accessible. Mural is a lot fancier, but it does, I believe, cost money. So if your institution has this available, I think it's a really fun whiteboarding tool. And then next, Mentimeter does have a free option. So I'll talk through what that is a little bit too. All right, so before I go into the demo, are there any questions? Okay. All right, so let me stop my share.
I actually do have a question for you.
Sure.
You mentioned a couple of your personal recommendations, and you mentioned Valerie. I didn't get the last name, but I think you said the name of the resource was Everyday Solutions.
Yeah,
right?
that's the name of her company.
Okay. And you named a second person that I didn't.
Dr. Kevin Sansbury. He's got a consulting company named Kivra, but he also has a really great podcast if you want to check it out. It's called Toxic Leadership. So that one, it has some really interesting insights when it comes to navigating organizations.
Thank you.
So I'm going to pull up Mentimeter and Jamboard first, just to show you what they are. And then I will switch to walking through some of the features that we have on Zoom. Let me get up a Jamboard. All right. So Mentimeter is one of my favorites. What it is a presentation tool. So you can think of it as similar to PowerPoint, but with integrated interactivity. So what you can do is build out a PowerPoint or a presentation within the platform. So it's not super sophisticated. The free version is probably going to be mostly text. What you can do is have people react via their phones. So there'll be like a little code that you can put in, and they'll go in on their phone and they can answer the questions, and the results will appear live on the screen as you're presenting. So this is a really great way if you want to do a quick poll, or if you're trying to do a Q&A. This is another way that you can capture questions. And let me see if they've got any good demos. They've got a word cloud feature. So there's kind of the base level free option, which I do know has the word cloud included. So this is a really fun way if you're trying to make a large event be a little more interactive, but you don't have time for a lot of conversation. So definitely love Mentimeter. If you ever end up using it and have questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm kind of the SME at my workplace. All right, I'm trying to find something that is not sensitive to share for Jamboard. Here, this is an untitled one. So Jamboard, what it is a whiteboarding tool that's available through Google. If you go to your Google and where you click to find like your Gmail, if you scroll down, it will usually show up there, or you can just search for it. And what it is a very sort of basic rudimentary whiteboarding tool, but what you can do is also plan in advance. So if you want to have some questions written out ahead, what is your favorite food? There. What is your favorite food? It could be like an icebreaker you have that you just share the Jamboard link with everybody in advance. Going into the meeting, they can go ahead and add to it. And this is a way to do that kind of chalk talk exercise that I mentioned too in a virtual setting. And the other thing that I really enjoy about Jamboard and Mural from a virtual context is you also have like a record of all of this feedback. So I don't know if you've had my experience where like you do the big exercise in person, and now you have so many Post-it notes that you have to go type up, or you're trying to read somebody's handwriting and you're like, oh God, what is this? When it's in a written text, it's sometimes a little easier to understand what people are trying to say. So definitely recommend Jamboard. Again, this is another one. If you have questions, feel free to reach out. All right, now moving on to Zoom. The thing that's challenging with Zoom is, I'm going to stop share. One of the challenges with Zoom is I can't show you all of the features because we're in it right now, but I can sort of talk through what some of them are. So I think most of us are generally oriented when it comes to Zoom, but for people who might be new, there's a few things I just want to call out that they may not be aware of. So first is, once you get into the meeting room, you should have a toolbar down at the bottom of the screen. In some cases, it might be showing up at the top, but you'll see the mute down in the left-hand corner, followed by your video button. And then what buttons you see next may vary depending on what's turned on. But usually the first one you see is participants. So when it comes to the participants button, if you click on it, you'll be able to see a list of the participants that are in the meeting room. Usually you can tell who's host as well. If you are the host, you do have different sort of options there. If you hover over someone's name, you can mute them if you need to. So in a facilitation setting, sometimes people can't find that button, you can help them out. I think someone muted me. Did I do that?
I tried it. I tried it.
Nice. So this is a great way to see who's in the room. Also, if you have the hand raise feature on, sometimes you can see next to people's names that they've got their hands up. So this is a way that you can see that there. Next is the chat. So you'll have a little chat window that pops up and you can see all of the questions that are coming in and the discussion that you have. I will say, since I did this training last, Zoom has added a lot of features to the chat that are really nice. So there's the little emojis that you can use to react. And also people can now reply to people within the chat, which is nice. And you can also upload documents if you need to in the chat, though I usually would recommend just dropping a link. So when you're thinking about facilitating a virtual meeting, make sure you have all those links that you want to be ready to share prepped in advance, so you can just drop them in there. Also, another thing I'll do is have like a Word document where I've got all the questions that we're going to be discussing in the meeting captured, so I can easily copy and paste it into the chat when we get to, maybe you're going to send everybody into breakout rooms. You want to share those questions in advance. All right, moving along, we've got share screen. So the share screen feature, if you click on it, there's several different options available looking at sort of that basic setting. The first two are usually sharing, whatever screen you've got open. I have two screens, so I'm seeing screen 1 and screen 2. You might just see your one screen. Also here, you'll see a whiteboard option. If you don't see it, let me know. But the whiteboard option, this might be for hosts only, is we'll open up a whiteboard that's kind of similar to what we discussed with the Jamboard, where you can have the members of the group interact. So here, I'll go ahead and try sharing the whiteboard with you so you can see what it looks like. Do you all have one? You see the screen now?
I see it.
All right. And at the top of your screen, or it might show up on the bottom, there'll be like a little toolbar that appears. So let's see. It'll say select, text, draw, stamp, spotlight, eraser, format, undo, clear. That showed up for you?
I
No.
don't have any of those options.
Okay.
I didn't have the whiteboard option either.
Okay, so the whiteboard option, going back to one of the things I was going to say in terms of the orienting, is that it is a feature that you need to turn on within Zoom. So after this meeting, one of the things I would recommend doing is going and checking out your settings. So in your settings, you want to, these are the ones I would check to make sure you've got turned on.
Okay.
They're going to help with your facilitation. Making sure you have breakout rooms turned on. So that's something that you're going to need to go and find. Also, polls are another great resource that you can turn on. Also, this whiteboard, and also annotate is the other tool that goes with the whiteboarding. That's that little sort of bar that you can use to interact with. No worries, Jennifer. And then recording. So if you are wanting to record calls, you need to turn that on in advance of your meeting to be able to use that feature. So there are other features in there, but those are the ones that I would really highlight as valuable when it comes to facilitating meeting. All right, so going back to the bar down at the bottom, so share screen. One of the things I do want to call out here is if you are going to be sharing a video, when you open that sort of share screen window, if you look in the bottom left corner, there's a share sound checkbox available. Right now we've got it unclicked. That's something you want to make sure to check if you are going to try and play like a YouTube video for people as a part of your meeting. And that will make sure that sound is coming from your computer.
I don't see that. You click on share screen and then what?
So when you click on share screen, if you look in the very bottom left corner, down at the bottom where like see where the share button is, if you go to the other side, there should be a share sound option.
The only thing on the bottom left is mute.
Okay, so but it's on the share screen pop-up window. And here, let me close, and maybe the issue is that I had it open. Here, click share screen.
Oh, and then share sound down.
Yeah, so if you are going to be sharing a video, yeah, from when you're choosing which screen you're going to share.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And sometimes that optimize video is also useful. Just
yeah,
it can be. You know, if you're sharing, for example, like a music video or something like that.
Oh yeah, because sometimes there can be a little lag depending on different internet speeds. All right, going back to the bottom bar here, if you've got it turned on, you may see a breakout room option, or you may see a record option. These will just vary depending on how the meeting's configured by the host. Now, the breakout rooms, there's 3 different ways that breakout rooms can work. Yeah, found the record button. When it comes to breakout rooms, you can preload who you want to be in which breakout room. So if you're in an organization where everybody's a part of like sort of the organization Zoom, you can put in their email addresses and create your groups in advance so that people will just directly go into the rooms that you've created for them. There's also the option to assign while you're in the meeting, so you can just quickly kind of sort people. This is going to be challenging if you have over 20 people in the meeting. And the third, which I think is probably the easiest if you're working with a large group, is Zoom now has the option where you just create the room and people can choose which room they want to join. So this is really nice if you're trying to do a discussion and maybe be like, you know, breakout room is going to talk about this event, whereas breakout room 3 is going to be thinking through our plan for next year. So how you can, it's a great way to like give people some choice, which I think probably helps with engagement. as they're participating in the meeting. All right, going back to the bottom here, we've got the reactions button. If you click on that, there'll be some sort of little basic reactions. If you want to get fancy with it, there's like 3 little dots, which will pop open an even bigger window if you want to get more creative with how you're reacting to the room. And this is also where you find that raise hand option. So if you click the raise hand option, it will stay on until they lower their hand. So the lower hand button will appear above this reactions one. And this is great if you're trying to, solicit engagement and use that raising your hand sort of experience in a virtual setting. All right. Apps. I don't know. I haven't played with this too much. I think that's a new one, but there's probably a lot of other plugins that you can use when it comes to Zoom. And then I've got a whiteboard option. Do you guys see that one?
No.
Okay. Might be because I'm host. But down here, there's sometimes other options that you can turn on and off that are available to you. One thing I do want to point out that would be fun if you are like maybe having a little more informal meeting or it's like a holiday, if you go over to your video and click on the little arrow caret next to it, you can go to choose a video filter or virtual background. And this is where you can have people set, if you want to have, something fun showing up behind them. I don't know if you can see it now. Now it's like I'm on TV or like in a big movie theater. So this is like a way to make things like a little more fun. Though I would say know your audience, and sometimes this may be really derailing what you're trying to achieve in the meeting. Okay, so I'm going to switch back to my blur if I can. There we are. Oh, I'm still stuck in the filter. All right, done. All right, so that's some of the just sort of basic Zoom features that are available. Polls, that's something that you can kind of do ad hoc, but also you can prep in advance. So you'll find polls under your settings in Zoom. And the way that works is you have the option to start the poll and then you can turn it off and you'll have like a little, the results will show up and it's something that you can share with the group and have them all see. So if you don't want to use Mentimeter or something else outside of Zoom, there is an integrated polling feature. All right, so I think that's what I had planned today. Are there any other questions or, concerns or other features you've got, questions about that you've never had a chance to use?
Yeah, I have set up meetings and gone through several of the things that you mentioned, but one question I have is regarding the difference between webinar and meeting, benefits and, drawbacks of either.
Yeah, so we're currently in Zoom meetings, which is, one we're probably all the most familiar with, but there's also Zoom webinar, which is the sort of, I would say it's probably more of an enterprise platform. So especially if you're working through a university, though I'm not sure, is there a free option of it too? I don't think so.
Yeah, maybe it's because I have an account, so I can do webinars. That's probably
Okay.
Yeah, that probably because
Yes.
it just sets up what you see, what the audience sees, and how you pin all the speakers and all of that kind of thing. But
yeah, so how Zoom webinar works is that it is, I would say, a little more restrictive in terms of how people can participate. So when you go into a Zoom webinar presentation as a participant, you're going to see the speaker showing up on the screen. You're not going to usually see yourself or everybody that's in the room. And it's a little more focused. There's usually a specific question or like Q&A chat available. Okay, it's an upgrade option. Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, so you do need to have a Zoom account for this. And I know depending on how many people you want to invite, you may need like a different level of membership. So I can't remember what the exact number is for probably like the basic level. It's probably like a couple hundred, but if you want to have more than that, you'll likely need to upgrade.
yeah,
So yeah, it is a little more restricted. So you don't have to worry about people coming in unmuted and disrupting things. You'll have people usually putting their questions into a chat setting. And you do want to have usually still a backup person watching that chat and sort of monitoring the questions. while you've got sort of your main facilitator as well as the guests that you may have present interacting. So it is a little more restrictive in terms of the tools that are available. But I think the goal with that is to, like, reduce the number of disruptions that can happen.
Yeah, and I think you can also you get a Q&A box in that case too.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Any additional questions?
Yes, I have one more.
Yeah.
In the world of Zoom, there is this thing I know Elizabeth is familiar with called Zoom bombing. And, from our perspective of, handling meetings, particularly if we're, depending on who's hosting and where the account is and so on. But people, if it's just open to the general public, and I unfortunately have been on one and only one, and that's enough. But is it possible, I mean, do you have sort of so your recommendations for, how to treat setting up the meeting? I also kind of feel that there are some instructions that kind of might need to be given to, if we're on a Zoom platform, obviously, but instructions that might also need to be given to attendees ahead of time so that in the case of such an event, they would know what to do or how to respond or not respond or what you want them to do.
Yeah. So the first step is really when you're setting up the meeting invitation in Zoom. There's several different features you can use to prevent this. So the first one I would say is always use like a unique link. So if you have like your personal room, that sometimes that's like a set sort of like number or code that's always yours. And I've accidentally bombed a few coworkers where I like ended up in a meeting that I wasn't supposed to be because they use the same link for every meeting. So definitely using a unique link. And then below that, there's usually a few other features that you can have. So you can either generate a password. There's also the option to create a waiting room so that you choose who's entering into the meeting. That's one additional thing you'll just need to be paying attention to as the meeting's going on. But you can assign a co-host if you want to have somebody be your backup in terms of watching that room and letting people in. You also can turn on or off whether people have their cameras or sound on when they enter the room. This is all within that sort of invite setup. And if you choose the mute one, that'll prevent sort of like, that one person that's like butt dialed into the calls, static coming in or whatever is happening. Now, if you've got a situation where there's maybe like a malicious Zoom bombing, I don't know if I've ever run into that. Usually it's much more like accidental kind of situation.
I mean intentional bad stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, if you've got an intentional situation, I think probably the best prevention there is to have that waiting room and somebody monitoring it and have discussed with your sort of backup in advance that, like, if Mr. Jones shows up, we need to be ready to boot him or, keep him on mute the whole time if we do want to have him present.
I think also one thing I've seen in my Zoom settings is that you can prevent people from taking over, like having the ability to share screen, or that's one reason for having that, or controlling the whiteboard, or who has access to the whiteboard, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that is a settings thing. And I think probably especially as like a teacher or an instructor, those are probably things you want to make sure that you have control of when you're in the meeting. So yeah, you can go into the settings. I think I'm going to see if you can change them while you're in the meeting. Probably the best option though, if you do have someone that's a problem in the meeting, is you can go over and probably click on them, and I believe you do have the option to eject them from the meeting if you need to. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Yeah, I understood that one way to control Zoom bombings was to send out an invitation, and only those people that respond to the invitation get their emails accepted, I guess, into Zoom. And then once that happens, it's not possible for someone to Zoom bomb.
Yeah, especially if you're using a unique Zoom link. I think that that would be a great way to do it, just to formally invite and directly invite those that you want to attend.
So you can't, you wouldn't be able to share your link with anybody else also.
Yeah.
Because only your email would get accepted.
Yeah. And I'm not super familiar with the backend on Zoom webinar, but I'm assuming that there's probably a way to have only people who signed up or registered for the event to join. I'm going to suppose that that's probably a likely.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. Yes.
Yeah.
So you have to decide before the meeting that you're going to the meeting. You have to agree to accept the invitation, and then your email is somehow stored, so that when you arrive at the meeting, you will get accepted, but they look at the email. That's my understanding.
I'll have to read more on that. That sounds like a great thing, for sure.
Yeah. And I wonder how much like Zoom bombing's still a thing. Like I could probably see it like in a university context, maybe with kids being kind of like, you know, trolls about stuff. But I would say like, I think the general wave we had during COVID of like random Zoom bombings, I don't know if that's as big of an issue anymore.
I was in a meeting this year, so.
Yeah.
Okay.
It was a AAA meeting.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah. Well, in that case, you know, I think the best plan is to just have your different scenarios planned out of like how we're going to address this, you know, so have your backup buddy. If there's anybody that they need to be watching for, make sure they know who it is. And also have a plan for if someone is disruptive or if someone just shows up, whether you're going to mute them or whether you're going to eject them from the meeting. I think it's good to have like a clear understanding of what you're going to do.
Yeah, and also watch the things that happen. We had what you said, Elizabeth, about the invitation only. What happened in this case, the same name was popping up like 3 times.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and people had the ability to change their names. And you don't necessarily want to prevent people from changing their name. I don't think it's necessary, but I think the ability to eject or to silence or whatever control things. But what was so odd about it was that after the meeting was over and they canceled the meeting, they disbanded the meeting. I got a message from Zoom that said something very strange. So clearly, even our email accounts have been taken as part of whatever happened.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Well, in that type of scenario, I don't know if that's something that you, as a user of Zoom, have the ability to prevent. That sounds like it might have been an actual like hacking, malicious software situation. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think in that case, probably the best thing that you can do is think about what types of information you're collecting and make sure that nothing sensitive is shared. So obviously email addresses, you know, those are, you know, not great if you get spammed at, but usually it's not as sensitive information, but make sure that like no other, like, you know, I guess personally identifying information shared in those meetings.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, Jacqueline and Jennifer. Any other questions? We could probably stop the recording and just chat too if we want.